Hi everybody, I'm Adriana and welcome back to my channel. I am so excited to be chatting with you guys today as we dig into another Faith Friday and Bible study with me as we continue on through the book of James and on into James chapter 4. So I'm gonna be very honest with you guys, when I read this chapter, I was like, oof, what do I even say about this? Yada yada yada. And the Lord was like, I didn't ask you to say anything, I'm gonna say something. So I literally just like whipped out my pen and started writing, and then he just kind of took over, and that is what happened 3 pages of notes later. So I'm going to read the chapter as I do with all my Bible study with me's. I read it first just so you guys can hear the word firsthand. We can read it through together, or you guys can read it on your own. You can skip to the part where we start breaking it down, whatever you want to do. But I'm going to read it first, and then if you guys see me looking at my notes, it is because the Lord was writing and I need to reference what was said. So let's go ahead and get on to reading, and then we will break it down. James chapter 4. Where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members? You lust and do not have. You murder and covet and cannot obtain. You fight and war, yet you do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask amiss, that you may spend it on your pleasures. Adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Or do you think that the scripture says in vain, the Spirit who dwells in us yearns jealously? But he gives more grace. Therefore he says, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Lament and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning, and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up. Do not speak evil of one another, brethren. He who speaks evil of a brother and judges his brother speaks evil of the law and judges of the law. Speaks evil of the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. There is one lawgiver who is able to save and to destroy. Who are you to judge another? Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will, go to such and such a city, spend a year there, buy and sell, and make a profit, whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. But now you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. Therefore, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. Okay guys, so that is James chapter 4, and it is very much about, well, I'm going to split it up into sections when we go through it. So we're going to split up into 4 sections, verses 1 through 6, verses 7 through 10, verses 11 through 12, and then verses 13 through 17. And so this is a really great chapter because at first when I started reading verses 1 through 6, I'm like, how does this really make sense? I don't really know how to talk about this from a personal applicable place, because I don't find myself in wars and fights, nor do I murder and all of that. But so it feels a little out of touch, but when you really read it, and we'll go through this, it's kind of setting the tone for just how imperative the rest of the chapter is. So if you read that, or if you heard me read it and you were like, I don't really know how this is going to apply to me, it always applies to you, I promise. So that's exactly what the Lord was telling me, and he was like, no, it applies. Just wait and see. So that's what we're gonna do right now. And I also just want to say that you guys have been asking for me to share my testimony, and I've been waiting for like a good time where I really felt like it was a good time to share it. And I think that this is a good chapter to kind of set that up, because especially because a good chapter in the Bible that we're going through, and then a good chapter in my life, because I was going to be sharing a my college experience video pretty soon. I promise this is relevant, but I really feel like I can't talk about my college experience without sharing my testimony, because it's so deeply connected and woven. So when I share that video, it will be both. So it'll be both my college experience and my testimony, and it very much has to do with pridefulness and humility and judgment and just humbling yourself before the Lord and seeing the fruits of that. And so we're going to go into that a little bit, but I just wanted to say that that is coming, and I'm going to be working on that, because I think that after this chapter that's a great this is a great time to share it. So just wanted to say that. So let's get excited for that, and pray for boldness for your gal to really just, share it all. So we shall see. But okay, so now digging into James chapter 4, now that we've said that. So as I said before, James chapter 4 verses 1 through 6, it sounds a little out of touch, you know? You're like, I don't find myself in wars and fights, I don't murder, how's this really relevant? You just kind of find yourself passively reading it, and that's what I love about these Bible studies with me, is that they kind of urge me to get past the passive reading and really apply it to myself and life and how to really apply what I read in the Bible. And verses 1 through 6 set up the tone for the rest of the sections that we're going to go through. So section 2 is what I'm going to call it. So verses 7 through 10, I believe, speak of the humbling process. And then verses 11 through 12 speak of avoiding being judgmental and avoiding creating yourself into a judge when we have no place to judge. And then the last section, verses 13 to 17, speak of avoiding boastfulness. And so those sections are very much telling us, like, you should avoid this, you should do this, who are you to do that? But it's not until verses 1 through 6, which he sets up right at the beginning, that you really realize, like, this is the warning of what happens when we don't humble ourselves, and when we don't avoid judgment, and we don't avoid boastfulness. And so verses 1 through 6, I'm gonna read it again I just feel like I need to read it again. So chapter 4 verses 1 through 6. Where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members? You lust and do not have. You murder and covet and cannot obtain. You fight and war. Yet you do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask amiss, that you may spend it on your pleasures. Adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Or do you think that the scripture says in vain, the Spirit who dwells in us yearns jealously? But he gives more grace, therefore he says, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Okay, so I think that what I got from that is verses 1 through 6 show how our pride, selfishness, and worldly desires lead to strife, war, and fights. You might not find yourself in what you think of when a war as in your brain, but it shows the strife, war, and fights that we have internally within ourselves, that we have externally in our relationships with people in the world, and that we have spiritually that we're not even seeing. And here James shows the destruction of sin as he mentions lust, murder, coveting, and adultery. And so these whenever you hear of these sins and you think of the Ten Commandments, those are big words, you know? But when you really think about it, it's lust. Lusting for things of the world. Lusting for the ways of the world. Lusting for things that aren't yours. For the life of other people. For the relationships other people are in. And murder. You can murder somebody just from hating them. And just looking away from them. And, you know, just casting someone out. Or wishing ill upon someone, talking ill upon someone, talking death over them, or coveting and wishing that something was yours, you know. And lust and covetousness, lust and coveting I think are very similar. Lust may be thought of more sexually. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that on YouTube. I don't know. We're gonna hope that that's okay. The Bible is not PG, guys, so there's that. Sorry, YouTube. But I know that lust is typically more thought of that way, but coveting is also more so, I guess I would say, of longing for things that are not your own, and longing for the life and the belongings and this and that of others. And then we have adultery, which we all know what that is. That one I'm gonna stay away from for the sake of my YouTube. But yeah, so we know what that is. But he mentions all of these sins, and they sound really far out when you think about them. There are ways to fall into this sin that are very easy for the average person's life, if you consider yourself the average person, you know? Because I know when I read that, I'm like, I'm not really doing this. But when you really think about it, it's very easy to fall into those things and let those sinful places or let sinful desires that fall into those categories lead us in our decision making and lead us in the way we interact in the world. And those things lead to strife and wars and fights internally, externally, and spiritually. And we'll see in chapter 4 that it says, you lust and do not have, you murder and covet and cannot obtain, you fight and war, yet you do not have because you do not ask, yet you ask and do not receive because you ask amiss, that you may spend it on your pleasures. And so the proud fall into these sins and act acting in these sins, and then they try to warp situations and take control of situations to make things work for their own personal gain. And so that verses 1 through 6 are showing what happens when we act from those places and we let those places lead us into our decision making and doing things for ourselves, rather than humbling ourselves before the Lord and looking to him as the mover and the decision maker and the doer, really. So that's just kind of leading us into the next one. And I know that can be like a little complicated, and I honestly hope that makes sense. I'm going to type out all of my notes and put them in the description, just in case you're more of like a, I need to read this person, because sometimes I'm that gal. But that's just kind of leading us into, and I think it'll make a little bit more sense as we keep going through. So that is verses 1 through 6. So verses 7 through 10. Move on to humility cures worldliness. And so what we read before is very much worldly thinking. You know, I want this in the world. I want to be this person. I want to have that person. I want to have these things. And I'm trying to get them for myself. And that is a place of worldliness, you know, even if it's lusting for acceptance, or lusting to have status and power and influence, you know, those are worldly things. And so humility is something that cures that. And so pride promotes strife is kind of in my Bible, it's the title of the section here, so you guys can't see it, but right here, chapter 4, it started out with pride promotes strife, and then humility cures worldliness. And so like I said, verses 1 through 6 really show the problem, and that is the strife that is caused by pride. And then verses 7 through 10 show us how humility has the power to clear the chaos that pride creates, and that those sins really boil up. And so with that, verses 7 through 10 speak of the humbling process. Humbling ourselves before the Lord is a constant process. I'm reading my notes now. So it's a constant process within us as our situations change. And if you don't know what humbling yourself before the Lord looks like, I'm going to kind of paint the picture a little bit when I keep reading my notes. But when you are full of pride and you think that you can control everything, and that you don't, and it might not be an active thought, you know, like you might not be actively thinking I can control everything, or actively thinking I don't need the Lord, or actively thinking I don't need the Lord's plans, my plans are good, not his. Or you might not be actively thinking any of these things, but when humbling yourself is part of the process where you look at the word and you dig into the word and you dig into who the Lord is and what he says is good, and you look at your past and how his plans have always prevailed, that you start to see that I don't have to be actively thinking these things to be acting from a place of pride, you see? And so I put in here like a little side note, if you don't humble yourself before the Lord in the word, he'll probably do it for you, and you might not love that too much. And that, we're gonna talk about that a little bit more when I talk about my testimony, but just telling you, if you don't humble yourself, he's gonna do it for you. And you might not like that way too much. I mean, it comes with fruit, he's always good, but it's not always easy. So when you draw near to God and read the word and truly understand the weight of sin and how big the price that Jesus paid for it, then you look at yourself and your thoughts and your actions, and you start to feel mourn and gloom. And so down here in verse 9, it says, lament and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. And when you read that at first, you're like, why is this being said? Why, like, the Bible's supposed to be hopeful, and the word's supposed to be hopeful and joyful. Like, why is this saying, let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom? And when you think of the humbling process, that's what happens. When you start to think about, that's what I said here, because humbling yourself happens when you realize my sin did that to Jesus. The times that I fell into lust and murder and covetousness and adultery and theft and every other sin that the Bible talks about, you know, like my sin, the ways I fall short, my imperfection, my willingness and my ability to fall into the ways of the world are what nailed Jesus to that cross. When you realize that my sin is what did that to Jesus, Jesus died for my sin, not my neighbor's sin, not my parents' sin, not my ex-boyfriend's sin, not my ex-best friend's sin. It's not their sin. When you truly realize and internalize, like, the weight of your own sin, my sin nailed Jesus to the cross, there's something that happens when you really dig into the word and it really becomes real to you. Like, I did that. Like, I am not a good person, you know, and it really becomes very real. Like, wow, I did that. There is a mourn that happens because you are mourning the part that you played in nailing Jesus to the cross. And when that happens, you are going to mourn and your joy is going to become gloom. But it's not meant to be left like that. That's what happens when you begin the humbling process. When you start to realize, oh my goodness, like, it's not all of those people that wronged me sins. It's not all of the bad people in the world's sin that nailed Jesus to the cross. It's my sin that nailed Jesus to the cross, and he died for me and he suffered for me. That you are going to experience that mourn and that gloom. And what I wrote down here is that when you do this, your sin becomes heavier to you and more noticeable as you realize what you've done and are doing that made the sacrifice so necessary. When that hits you, you're going to mourn the part you played in nailing Jesus to the cross. And then I keep saying I said, but this is not me. And then, so this sounds so doom and gloom because it is. This is sad. It is a sad thing. When you realize that, it is like, it should bring you to tears. I know it brings me to tears whenever I really like dig deep into it. And this is part of what happens when you kind of have like that God moment, or just that moment where you are like, wow, like I did that. And if you haven't had that moment yet, like, everybody's relationship with the Lord and everybody's experience with the word is so different. But I feel like there's always a moment when you really realize the weight of your sin and the weight of Jesus' sacrifice. And that is when you really realize, like, wow, I am nothing and he is everything. And that's why it sounds so doom and gloom, because it is. But it's also so important to move on to the next verse where it says, let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. But when you move on to the next verse, he makes sure to say immediately, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord and he will lift you up. When you are humbling yourself in the sight of the Lord, meaning, wow, I suck because Jesus is awesome, and he is so good and he did that for me. That is humbling yourself in the sight of the Lord and humbling yourself to the word, which is where we're supposed to compare ourselves to, and he will lift us up. Because what Jesus did was not in vain, and our sin may have nailed him there, but it did not keep him there. We did not have the power to keep him there. He defeated sin and death, and he gave us the grace. He gives grace to the humble, and he is our hope and joy. And he loves us too much to let us live blindly in our sin, but he also loves us too much to live in guilt and shame and condemnation. And so while you will experience mourn and gloom in the humbling process of realizing it was my sin that nailed him there, and I am not the good person that I think I am, none is good but God, you're going to experience that mourn. But then he comes right back and says, wait, let me finish the story. I beat that for you. I paid the price for you, and you've got a seat at our table because I did that for you, and because I love you too much to let you live with guilt, shame, and condemnation and in sin. And you are not going to feel less than, even though you know that you are the king of sinners. You are not anymore. I paid that price for you and you are mine now. And so that, I just think, first off, that's beautiful and can make me emotional. But yeah, so that's what this one about in the humbling process, is knowing that the Lord, measuring yourself up to what the word says and the word, and realizing, wow, I did that and he did that for me, but he loved me too much to live. He loves me too much to live in my sin, but he also loves me too much to let me feel condemnation and guilt and shame and to be joyless. He is our joy, and he replaced all of that. So that's kind of what this next section is about. And so that is kind of the humbling process, when Jesus becomes the measuring stick at which you look at your life, and the lens at which you look at the world. And so now we can move into verses 11 through 12, which I think follow up so well with that. And this one can be tricky to interpret. Well, this one can just be tricky because interpretations of what judgment looks like are so different. But the bottom line is, it starts off right off with saying, do not speak evil of one another, brethren. Plain and simple, no interpretation necessary. That is what was said. And so when you realize, I watched a sermon, or I didn't watch a sermon, I was there for the sermon. This was like a long time ago, of my college pastor, and I went to Greenhouse Church at the University of Florida, or in Gainesville. I just went to the University of Florida, and Pastor Mike was the pastor who said this, and it was a whole sermon on realizing and recognizing yourself as the king or queen of sinners. You know, like, I am the king of sinners, and when I realized, and like, again, like what we said, when I realized it was my sin that nailed Jesus to the cross, I have no room to speak evil of anybody else, because that is the ultimate humbling, you know? When you realize I am the king of sinners, not this person in prison who may have killed a gajillion people, you know? I am. It was my sin. And so when you humble yourself before the word and know that it was your sin that nailed Jesus to the cross, there is no room to talk evil of anyone else. And when you humble yourself in wisdom and know that your sin is covered, so humbling yourself before the Lord is better than humbling yourself before anything else, because you humble yourself and you feel low, but then he brings you right back up. And so when you know that, you can consider yourself the king of sinners before you look at anybody else, and immediately you cannot judge them or speak ill or evil of them, because you are the lower and you are the least. And that is just the best way to break up that section, is to not speak evil of one another. And when you think about yourself in that way, you simply can't speak evil of one another and break that and fall into that. And that comes from a place of humility. And when you constantly keep that mindset in your mind, like, I am the king of sinners and I was the king of sinners, you know? And we constantly fight and battle sin, but like, Jesus paid it all for us. But when you constantly keep that in your mind, you think of yourself as like, I'm the lowest of the low, but he's the one that lifts me up. So you're not feeling guilt and shame about it, but you're like, I am the low of the low. I can't judge them. I can't speak ill of them. I can't speak evil on them. I can't speak down to them, because I am the least. And so that is just part of the humility that comes, that is being spoken of here. Something else that I wrote here is that humility doesn't bind you or constrain you. It sets you free and it blesses you. When you can come to another person, yeah, so that's something that I think is tricky, because I think when you are still in that prideful place in your heart, and we always fall into pride, and sometimes we gotta cast it out and pray about it, you know, but when you are still living in that pridefulness, not really realizing that, like, I did that to Jesus and he did that for me, it can be like, who are you talking to? Like, I'm the king of sinners, you know? Like, I feel like I could be very easy to take offense to, which is probably a sign that we need to do a little bit humbling. But I think it's so important to know that humility does not bind or constrain you. It sets you free and blesses you. When you can come to another person with no agenda, with no judgment, and show them love, the love of Christ, humbly, you are making so much room for the Lord to come in and bless that situation and bless that person and bless you. There's something that happens when you humble yourself. You are just so much more available. You are just making so much room in your heart for the Lord to move and to work. And not just your own life, but in the life of others. And it's so noticeable when somebody comes up to you and they are just loving on you completely selflessly. You know it immediately, and you know when that person is full of the Holy Spirit and there's not a prideful bone in their heart, because they know that Jesus has done it all for them. You know that, and it's a totally different experience. And so if you're feeling like getting rid of that pride is a burden almost, you don't even realize that the pride itself is the burden, you know, and that there is so much joy and so much good that happens when you free up that prideful space in your heart and let the Lord take it over and do what only he can do with it. And so that is verses 11 through 12. So moving on to verses 13 through 17 now. Humility and resisting the urge to boast, really. And so there's a difference. I think it's important to say that there's a difference between celebrating what the Lord has done and is doing in your life versus boasting. And I think it's important to say that, because I know that when always talking about yourself is always tricky. You know, like, it's always like, where is that line between I want to celebrate what the Lord is doing and what he's done, what he's got me through, and like speak of him, and then like boasting, you know, like where do I draw that line? And so that's something that I've had conversations about before plenty times. And so I'll share a personal example on this one. And it's a conversation that Robert and I had a couple months ago. And if you're like a professional in the corporate small business world, I don't know, if you're a professional, you got a LinkedIn, then we can have a chat about that. So I came across a post, I promise this makes sense. I came across a post where somebody was saying that they think it's rude to post about like job announcement, like you got a job on LinkedIn, because of how many people on there don't have a job, you know, or are looking for jobs. And Robert and I were talking about this. Robert's my fiance. If you're new to my channel, well, welcome. We were talking about this because he kind of agreed with the guy, and I was like, no, I can't agree with that. And I think it all depends on where your heart is, and your heart and your intention will definitely shine through, because they're the difference. I think that we are when the Lord does something good, we better show it off. Not show it off, but like show him off, you know, and show what he's doing, because that is an act of worship in, you know, like exalting him and being like, look at my God, look how good he is, look at what he is doing. So there's such a difference between celebrating what the Lord has done and is doing, and then being boastful of ourselves and our own abilities, you know. And so I think that there's a distinction there, and there's a heart difference there. And so I just wanted to talk about that first before we go into a section about boasting, because if you are boasting about the Lord, boast. But if you are boasting about yourself and your own abilities and your own I don't know, just like yourself from a prideful place, that's very different. And so I just wanted to say that, because I know that some people stop themselves from celebrating things in their life that I'm like, no, worship the Lord in that celebration, you know. So I don't know, there's a difference there, and I just wanted to say that before we go on. But this section, verses 13 to 17, is saying to be careful not to boast about your own plans. And again, we're going to talk about this in my testimony again, because literally all of this could have fixed my whole testimony real fast. I would not have had to go through a lot. I really wouldn't. And so we'll talk about that eventually. But so this is saying to be careful to not boast about your own plans. And so I'm going to read it again. So James chapter 4 verse 14 is, whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. But now you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. Therefore, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. And so I think that is an important thing to think about there, because this again has to do with pridefulness, and how the prideful long for their own plans and long for the desires of their heart, and the desires of their heart care more about their own wants and their own ways and their own lustful and covetous and all of those desires that are sinful and can be sinful. And I think it's really important to remember that just because it's not wrong to want things, and it's not wrong to have dreams and hopes for the world, you know, and for your life in the world. That's not wrong at all. It's wrong when you care more about the things you want than what the Lord wants, which is why it's saying here, we ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. And I think that comes from a place when you humble yourself. Again, it's all part of this continuous humbling process. Like, this is not something like, when I'm talking about this, I'm not coming from a place of, oh, I've humbled myself and I'm gonna be prideful about having humbled myself. Like, no, that's not a thing. I've humbled myself and I'm gonna keep humbling myself, and that's why it's so important to keep reading the word and keep reading your Bible and keep praying and talking to God, because you will continuously be humbling yourself throughout your life. Because it's very easy, like, I can see how that would be very easy to humble yourself and then start being prideful about how humble you are, and that's just insanity. But it's real, which is why it's so important to continue being diligent in the word and consistently humbling yourself. But that was a tangent, so my bad there. But that's why it's so important to continue saying, like, when you do go through that humbling process, you continuously humble yourself, you start to see how the Lord's ways are so much better than yours, and you want what he wants. And so continuously working on your heart to make sure that your wants and desires align with his and wanting his will above your own is casting out that selfishness in your heart and casting out that pridefulness and coming from a place of humility and love for the Lord and his will and his ways. And so that's where it says that when you boast about your own ways and you boast about, like, my plan, you know, when you, I could talk about this, like, when I was in high school, I was very prideful, and I may not have noticed it. I notice it now, but I was very prideful and boastful about, like, my academics, and I was like, yes, I'm gonna be a doctor someday, I'm gonna be a surgeon, and yeah, I got my AA in high school before I even graduated, and I'm gonna finish college in like 2 years and go to medical school and this and that, and I'm gonna go to Johns Hopkins and all this. And I was boasting about my plans, especially being a senior in high school. You know, I wanted to like talk all about it and tell everybody my plans, yada yada yada. And sorry, a squirrel outside of my window completely distracted me. Like, that was, wow, that was such like a stereotypical, like, oh, squirrel. But anyways, it was like hopping straight at my window. But anyways, so wow, the distraction that happens. But yes, so that was coming from a place of boasting about tomorrow, which is exactly what it talks about here. And you don't know, that was me not longing for the Lord's plans above my own. That was me very much manipulating everything that I could to go according to my ways. And what happened? I didn't get any of that. And am I mad about it? Absolutely not, because what the Lord had in store was far better than any of my plans. But that boastfulness about your own plans and your own ways and wanting your own ways above the Lord's, it is a sin, and it's never fruitful, and it's never good. And it just kind of ties that all back together. And when you really this is all about humbling yourself before the Lord. Humbling yourself before the Lord over and over and over and again in your life and in your heart, so that you can cast out that pride, you can cast out that selfishness, you can cast out that judgmentalness, and you can cast out that boastfulness, so that when people see you in the world, they just see somebody after the heart of Jesus, after the wants and the will of the Lord, and you were just living for the Lord. And it's not all about like what other people see. It's an internal thing. Like I said, like at the beginning I said, this is the strife that happens internally, externally, and spiritually. And humility has the power to, humility in the word and in the Lord has the power to cure all of that strife that happens internally, externally, and spiritually. So that is that on James chapter 4. But yeah, there's just so much freedom that comes, freedom and blessing that comes in humbling yourself before the Lord. And it's not an easy process, and it is a continuous process. Like, constantly, you will constantly find yourself in situations where you are having to die to self and remind yourself, like, I am the king of sinners, I am the least of the least. Jesus is the highest of the high, and I cannot judge this person. I am called to love. I am called to be humble. And it's going to be a constant process, but I really encourage you guys, after going through this, if you haven't done that lately, or if you haven't done that at all, I really, really encourage you to just spend some time maybe reading through the life of Jesus, like in Matthew, and reading through the life of Jesus and getting to know Jesus. Watch The Chosen. The Chosen is a TV show about the life of Jesus, and they've only done season 1, but I feel like it does a really great job at helping you like almost get to like feel like you got to know the personality of Jesus almost. And the more you get to know him and love him so much, and then you see the suffering that he went through, it really internalizes for you, like, I did that, like, you know. And it just becomes so real. When it becomes that real for you, it really helps ignite that humbling process, and you can constantly come back to that. And so yeah, yeah, so that's my encouragement for you. If you are like looking for something like, okay, now what do I do about this? How can I even start this? I really encourage you to just like really dig into who Jesus is and really pray for the Lord to continue work on your heart, and just humble you through the word. Like I said, if you don't, he might come and just do it for you. So that happened to me, and I'm excited to talk to you guys about it. And it's exciting to talk about I think it's exciting to talk about my testimony now. When I started college, it was such a I'm getting ahead of myself, but when I started college, I was like, my testimony, like, what is that even? And when I talk about my testimony, I mean, like, that is when I really truly felt like I met the Lord, and like I am now walking with the Lord and in relationship with the Lord, and this is what brought me to it. And I probably didn't realize that when I started college, because I was in the middle of it. So that's what that looked like there. But we'll get into that in the other video. But thank you guys so much for this little Bible study with me. I know that it ended up longer, just like I said was probably gonna happen. I'm sorry. It happens, but thank you guys for bearing through it with me. I feel like this is a really powerful chapter, and if you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them down below. Again, I'm gonna write out my notes in the description if you are more of a visual learner where you need to like read it out. So yeah, but thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. Let's chat, and if you guys have any questions or anything that you want to share in the comments, I'd be happy to read it and go in there and engage with you guys. But yeah, thank you guys so much, and I will talk to you guys later. Bye.